here. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the End in Mind podcast. I'm your host, Caitlin. I have our lovely guest here today, Meg. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here.
It's going to be super fun. Can you start off by telling us what you do, who you are? Give us your little intro before we dive into some crazy topics, which tend to come up when you and I connect.
Yes, absolutely. Well, my name is Meg Gluth to be specific. I'm the CEO and owner of a company headquartered out in the Seattle, Washington area named Catalynt Solutions. Catalynt is kind of a business, I call it the hidden economy. We procure and sell all of the raw ingredients used to make things. So the molecules and compounds that go into things like a gallon of paint or infant formula or soft drinks or the back sticky side of tape. We're sort of involved in all of that. So that's part of the business. And the other part of the business is that we actually make some of those things at our manufacturing plant in Chicago. We are a contract manufacturer where a number of name brands would have us make their product and put it in under their label and ship it out for them. So it's kind of a fascinating world of manufacturing and also international molecule chemical distribution and raw material distribution.
Oh, so cool. I just love what you do. I feel like it's so complex and how many different industries you probably learn about and know about. And can you explain the array, of how many different industries you all work with and get to know?
For sure, for sure. So like I said, our customers include people who make paint, include people who make the back sticky side of tape. They include people who make infant formula. They include people who make soft drinks. They include companies that make downhill drilling fluids, industrial cleaning supplies, even some pharmaceutical compounds, all sorts of things. And so what's cool about that is that I get to learn about how a lot of different things are made. And not only that, but also all of the factors that affect the costs that go into how things are made and how like the weather in Panama can affect whether or not it's going to cost you more to get orange juice this year or not. All of that kind of stuff. Just it's fascinating. No day is any the same. And I just love it. I love every minute of it because I'm a person who likes to learn.
It's so cool because I love your perspective on business. When I first got into investing with my investor, I didn't understand that businesses could be so heavily impacted by some of the things like you mentioned, weather,
Yep.
until you really get into this space. And I think a lot of
Mhm.
people that do invest may not be taking these variables into account, which is why I was so excited to have you on and, talk about even things like tariffs and taxes and really boil
Yep.
this down for like the common
For
person.
sure.
Always get it. I know I didn't for many years.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of a misnomer and maybe even a little bit unfair to ourselves to expect that we would understand all of that. Before I did this, and in fact, when I started at the company, I started as the company's first lawyer. I considered myself really well educated. I was a counsel representing businesses and things like that, and I thought I knew a lot about a lot, and I did. But when you get into how things are actually put together and things are actually made, and you understand sort of the basis of how all of these companies make their money and raw material costs, it is an entire world that candidly we don't think about so much. And so when we're talking about things like taxes and tariffs, I mean, tariffs are obviously top of mind. You and I are recording this at the end of May, and there's a certain amount of I would say global trepidation about what's about to happen, but there's some very real economic impacts there that I think I wouldn't have known about. And I'm not sure that we should, get too down on ourselves for that.
Right. It's like, we all don't know what we don't know until we
Mhm.
enter this space. And then I know for myself, I got into business and I'm like, wow, the Europe, economy is really thriving. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden I got a lot of clients in Europe virtually. And then it kind of came back to the US and being
Yeah,
really fluid with as these things change. Can you explain some of that fluidity and how it's helped your company stay,
for
so
sure.
large and cater so many different industries?
For sure. So part of what we bring to a company, we represent a lot of Fortune 500 companies that, like I said, make things in the US. The majority of my customers are US customers. but that is not to say that the majority of my business is domestic. Most of the compounds, molecular compounds, raw material compounds, things like that, that are used to make, let's say, the paint that goes on the outside of an airplane. A lot of those things are made in the United States, but a lot of those molecules are not made here. And part of this conversation we're having around tariffs and things like that is like, what does it really mean to be made in the, can we feasibly try and make here? We have a certain limitation on the amount of raw materials, earth minerals, things like that, that come and are present in our country. And we're going to have an overseas relationship for a lot of those. But also, we sort of lack what I would call like an investment incentive. I'm not going to, for example, make a single use plant that makes only one color pigment for that paint that goes on the side of an airplane. And maybe it would make sense for us to continue to have relationships with countries overseas that do that. The value that I bring to a company in the United States is they call me and they say, okay, we need chemical A in order to make whatever our product is. And my job is to say, maybe the first round of that product is made here in the United States, but what's our backup? And what's our backup to that? And sometimes good diversification for a business is also intended to be diversification outside of the country for various reasons. A lot of the plants that make chemistries in the United States are all located in the same place, and they are located in a hurricane path. If you are sole sourced in products that are made in Houston, Texas only, or in Louisiana only, you might have a problem should they have to shut their facility down for a weather-related event. And so my job is to provide a secondary and tertiary source of supply to maintain supply chain continuity so that they can continue to make their products and sell them to the outside world. Now, if you have a product that you make that has 10 different raw materials in it, and 9 of the 10 are manufactured overseas and are probably never candidly going to be made here in the United States. Like I said, we can go into why that is, but there's just a lot of these things will just never be made here. And all of a sudden, there's a tariff on every single one of those raw materials. What is happening is that that tariff then gets passed along to the consumer, from me to my consumer, from that consumer to you. And the inflationary practice there and the inflationary effect there is going to be felt, let's say, times 10, if there's 10 of those things. And so I think a lot of people don't think about that when they think about, maybe we want to make the automobile in the United States, but what of all the parts that go into the automobile? We have some very real things to think about there when we talk about eradicating free trade altogether.
And the time that it probably takes, right? Like,
Yes.
I'm sure your
Yes.
clients, when they come to you, they know that they're, a year or 2 years out to their product being, fully
Right.
physical in some way. So I
Right.
do think there's a lot of impatience naturally as the consumer side of me feels as well, what are the
Yeah.
answers? And sometimes it's, I'm sure, a time factor. I'd love to know your perspective on that too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of companies pre-make a lot of what they're going to sell year, maybe two in advance. And just to be honest, a lot of that, the more specialized it gets, the more time they need. You take a product like infant formula, you need to test that. You need to have all sorts of checks and balances to make sure everything there goes right. And I want to be clear, like that's some of those kinds of products being made in the United States, like the standards there, we do such an exceptional job. But in order to do that, you can't rush that, so to speak. And so we have to plan ahead for that. We have to try to pre-order raw materials for that. Right now, a lot of my customers feel a nervousness about that. What if I go ahead and place an order for raw materials I'm going to need 4 to 6 months from now, but by the time they get here, there's a tariff of double on them? Or conversely, what happens if it's less? That could be a good, happy surprise. And of course, we'd pass the discount along. But what it means is that for a lot of these companies, managing their costs of goods, planning for their costs of goods has become increasingly more difficult. And there's really a lack of ability to do that well right now.
That makes so much sense. And then comes the fear, which can sometimes have a lot of, overspill into other areas of the market. Can you explain some of that where you were able to see and maybe even forecast the consumer market since you're really on the front lines here?
Yeah. I'm struggling to forecast, and I think my customers are too. If I'm totally honest, I think that's part of what you're seeing reflected in market volatility right now too. We used to have customers, and again, I don't use their names, but these are brands you would recognize just walking on looking on the shelves of Home Depot or Walmart or whatever. We used to have customers that could forecast what they thought their business was going to be within a 5 to 10% margin of error for an entire year. And they would then place their orders for their costs of good or for their goods and their raw materials. Maybe they'd just place the whole year's orders and then we'd make micro adjustments. What I'm seeing right now in the last 6 to 9 months in particular, and then I don't expect this to get a whole lot better this year without some stability, frankly, on tariff policy and trade policy, is this idea of like being they absolutely have no idea. They're scared to forecast out because they don't want to sit with warehouses full of goods that are more expensive than they need to be, or frankly not sure where their end market is. The other side of this that we're not really talking about is a lot of my customers that make things in the United States export those things, right? And so when you have the retaliation too, they don't necessarily know whether the market for their goods in Europe, whether Europe is going to want to be a buyer, whether China will be a buyer, Canada and Mexico. A lot of these areas, there's this uncertainty. So what we've seen is the buying cycle shorten and tighten up. And so what happens is that maybe they'll call me this week and say, we need something here next week because we are going to go ahead with this batch. And what that does for a business like mine, and I'm certainly, not alone in the sort of forefront of the commercial markets here, is that it requires me to hold a lot of inventory, which becomes very risky for me. And it requires me to be able to make maybe smaller just-in-time deliveries, which then increases some of the logistics costs and things like that, all of which are passed down the value chain and are passed down to the consumer. So even with a pause in tariffs, this uncertainty, the fact that we have a lack of knowing what's coming and a lack of really stable federal policy on tariff and trade, is already churning into the market sort of increased costs. We're pricing in uncertainty, if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense because we have to start to think, if we can, like you said, give the discount, we'll gladly pass that on. But if
For
we
sure.
can't, we have to bake it in, to protect
That's right.
ourselves too.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of my customers, I think, are feeling that way too. How much will Caitlin pay for a gallon of paint? Right now, that might be a little bit different than if we have a different set of policies 6 months from now. So do you want to pre-make all of that with that baked in higher cost and then sort of rely on that price going to market 6 months from now? It's a very tricky proposition. It really is true that markets crave stability and crave certainty. And we used to think that that was, or maybe some people even now do, because I think sometimes, and you probably see this in your work even more than I do, like sometimes the media tends to just bake that in as, oh, Wall Street is fickle and moody. But there are some very real sort of factors within the manufacturing space, industrial production space, where these things come to bear in a very, dollars and cents sort of way. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to me, especially being a service-based business, but I work
Yeah.
with clients, that offer a product mainly so
Yeah.
nowadays. And you can see, the emotions and the fear factors, but they're valid, emotions. Like, I would
100.
say if a client can afford us, no worries. Like, we want you to be successful. That's the whole reason why we created this partnership. Um,
Right.
which you do, you have to kind of hold some of that space on either side. And also, as especially starting my company young, learning not to take it personal. It really
Yes.
is just a business decision for sure.
That's right. That's right. And I think nowadays we're seeing a lot of that, right? A lot of questions. I mean, even I, as a business owner, like I'm looking at all elements of my business saying, what can I afford to do 6 months from now?
Yeah.
I'm truly in a space of uncertainty. Do I think that business will entirely dry up? I don't think I feel that way, but I do think I have a sense of just this really forced inflationary pressure that I have to absorb somewhat and that my customers have to absorb somewhat. And I think the fear for all of us is like, how much of that can the system really take? I,
Yeah.
I don't really know.
It's such a good point, this uncertainty. And, it's interesting because a lot of people, again, they don't think this in depth to it and think
Mhm.
about your end and think about everybody that has gone into this planning and, how many items need to be purchased from afar in
Yeah,
order to make one product.
right. And I think a lot of people sort of labor under the delusion that if we just go ahead and bring every factory to the United States, like that'll solve all our problems. And it just really isn't like that. Like, I, this is again probably a subject for a different podcast, but there are so many things that go into putting up a plant. But in the United States, one of the most important things is that we want a return on our investment in doing so. And so, for a lot of these raw materials, if you're going to put up a plant that in some cases, as I alluded to, can really only make one or two things, you really need to know that you're going to get through permitting okay. You need to know that this product is going to be, that is going to be in demand when you're finished getting permitting and building done in 2 to 3 years. The interest rate environment needs to be such that you can finance that build. Most people aren't building a factory in cash. And you have to have some predictability. Right now, a lot of the regulatory policy and tax policy is being set by an administration that will be here for 3 years. And that's not a 3 more years. That's not a dig on the present administration. That's literally how American government works, right? We change it out frequently. And so sometimes when you're looking at long-term investments and thinking, do we have the space and capital and human capital, the labor to staff literally building everything we could ever need in the world here? I would suggest that the answer is no. And I think that a lot of what we do make here um, is well served by having a consumer market from overseas too, from having people who want to buy what we make here too. And so I'm an advocate, maybe not necessarily for totally free trade, but I'm definitely an advocate for making predictable and stable agreements that can stand the test of time that we can all plan on.
I love that perspective. I value that a lot as well, especially as more and more people are getting into market and investing. Like, I know for myself, like you mentioned, I was like, okay, everything's looking great. And I'm like 15 when I'm making some of these decisions. I think I'm going to be
Okay.
set for life. My financial
Yeah.
advisor calls me 4 years from them and then he goes, hey, this is a volatile time. You have to be aware, you have to know what's going
Yeah.
on. And that was a whole nother 180 learning lesson. So for our investors out there that are maybe, struggling on where to go in the market, the whole purpose of having Meg on was to let you all know it's okay. The majority of the
Yes.
market's feeling that way, right?
Yep. Yep. I do think too, like, I everything has a cycle to it, right? And so whatever dip you find yourself in, I mean, I think we see US industrial production starting to turn, from the bottom and go back up. I think there's so many excellent economic indicators right now. And there are a lot of things that are tricky, but I think it's always good for us to remember it's always been that way. Like nothing has ever been perfect star alignment, everything's great. There's always a few things that can make you a little nervous. And to your point, I think being a really diversified investor is smart. I think um, while I am a dyed in the wool patriot and I support this country, I certainly have investments all over the world. I think being a person that's well rounded and has a diverse portfolio, there's a reason that pretty much every financial planner with their salt will tell you to do that. And I think that in terms of our businesses and in terms of our investments, I think that's always going to be advice that will stand the test of time.
Thank you so much, Meg, for saying that. I think that that's like a perfect ending note where
Mhm.
everyone can have more of a roundabout portfolio. It'll end up
Mhm.
saving us, especially for myself
Mhm.
during COVID. That's why I expanded to the Europe market. People were working online faster than they were here because it hit them faster. So
Sure,
it was a nice balance, and I still have a lot of those contacts over there. So it benefits us, right? In the
for
long.
sure, for sure. And I think it just makes you better at business, right? I mean, I think maybe you could say something about this, but I mean, I think you would agree. You're sort of enriched by having an understanding of how it goes there. It serves the way you do things here.
Yeah, yeah, it taught me so much about people. And, a lot of my clients over there were coming from more of this like higher perspective on business. And it gave me this level up that we weren't really facing here in the US just quite yet, because of that
Right.
lull in the time. So, like you said, it was kind of cool to be able to forecast and predict some of those outcomes in the consumer market side of things.
For sure. For sure.
Thank you so much, Meg. This was so wonderful. Is there anywhere that we can connect with you or stay updated with you and, check out where you're speaking? Because I know you're doing a lot of speaking nowadays.
Sure. My website is megangluth.com. It's a great way to get a hold of me, at least to start. I always tell people it's a lot better than my LinkedIn inbox is not the place to find me. I'm terrible at managing that. But if you start at my website, I'm going to get back to you for sure.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. And for our multitasking listeners, we'll have all the links below so you can reach out with her, catch up with Meg, see where she's speaking, what her take is on everything. And thanks again.
Thanks, Caitlin.